teenage girl was writing a paper for her high school class. She came to her dad and she said, Dad, what is the difference between annoyance and anger and exasperation? And he said, well, honey, it's mainly a matter of degree. Let me illustrate. And so her father picked up his phone and he just dialed a number at random. And the man answered, and her father said, hello, is Melvin there? And the guy on the other end said, there's no one here by the name of Melvin. Said, you got the wrong number. Hung up, and father said, now, see, the man wasn't happy with our call. He might have been busy doing something else, and he was annoyed that it was the wrong number. He said, now watch this. So he just hits redial. Guy answers. Father says, hello, is Melvin there? And the guy said, look, I just told you there's no one here by the name of Melvin. You just called this number. You got a lot of guts calling me again. Father turned to her and said, that's anger. He was mad. Now let me show you what exasperation is. So he hits redial again. The guy answered and his voice roared, hello. The father calmly said, hello, this is Melvin. Has there been any calls for me? Now, we'll all face in our lives all sorts of exasperating, annoying, and sometimes things that cause us anger. We deal with rush hour traffic. We deal with long lines at the fast food restaurant. We deal with mechanical devices that let us down sometimes. They're supposed to be adding to our convenience. We have people that do things that upset us and annoy us and anger us. And we speak of these expressions of anger in very graphic ways. We say, he was boiling mad, or fuming mad, or steaming mad, or that was a heated argument. And all of this speaks to the issue of anger. In 5 previous lessons on home improvement, we've been talking about different ways in which we can do better in our relationships and our family life. We can improve our homes. And I think definitely one of the ways in which we can improve our homes is learning to control our anger. And so this morning I want us to think about anger management in the home. I've chosen this lesson not only because I think it's so practical and applicable and pertinent to everyday life in our families, but also that was one of the things that was suggested in the recent survey the elders had handed out, that more than one person wanted me to talk about the issue of anger. And I thought, what a perfect time to talk about the biblical principles dealing with the problem of anger than to talk about it in the home. Sure, it's good to see each one this morning. We have several guests that are visiting with us today, and some of you are visiting the community. Maybe you're looking for a church home. And we welcome you, and we hope that you'll come back and be with us on other occasions. We'd love to talk to you about being a part of our church family. Some of you may be traveling, and there are various ones that are here from different places, and we recognize you and appreciate you and glad that you are with us in our assembly this morning. I hope the things that we have to say for the few minutes will help us in our understanding of the biblical issue of anger, and specifically help us as we deal with it in our home lives. The fact is, in any relationship, there's going to be conflict at times. And what we have to learn how to do is to disagree without being disagreeable. How to even argue in a way without assassinating the character of another person. And how to differ with others without falling into discord. In Proverbs 11 and verse 29, the wise man said, he who troubles his own house will inherit the wind. So this speaks directly to our issue of anger management in the home. Now think about that simple proverb. He who troubles his own house will inherit the wind. Now what does that mean? Well, it's been explained this way. The man who brings trouble in his family will have nothing in the end. Now that's a pretty good commentary on that verse. And so I want to talk about 4 things this morning that will help us in dealing with our anger, and especially as we relate it to our home lives. And I think the very first thing that all of us need to be honest enough to do is just to admit our anger. We need to stop denying that we have anger. I mean, anger is real. In Ephesians chapter 4, beginning of verse 25, Paul said, "Therefore put away lying. Let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another." And then he says this, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil." Now this is a passage we're going to camp on a little bit and we're coming back to with some other points. But this is a very important passage for us to understand. That in our anger, do not sin. One modern speech translation says, "Do not sin by nursing your grudge." You know, a lot of the problem with anger is that we deny that we have anger, and we feel something on the inside that upsets us, that irritates us, that annoys us, and we allow that to develop into some deep-seated anger, but we don't want to admit it. Now, in relating to the home life, I don't know if any of you have ever encountered a scenario like this, that a husband says or does something before he leaves for work that upsets his wife. And he goes on to work not even maybe knowing that she's upset of something he said or did. And all day long, she's fuming about that. She is stewing over that remark or that insult, whatever it was, and that it bothers her. And so he comes home in the evening, walks into the kitchen. By the way, this is a stereotypical illustration, not real life. Walks into the kitchen where she's fixing supper. She doesn't acknowledge him. And he comes up behind her like us guys like to do with their wives a little bit and kind of gives a little hug from behind. And he feels this. She stiffens up. And being the perceptive individual that he is, he said, "Is everything okay?" And she goes, "Oh, everything is fine." He goes on, maybe sits down, looks at his iPhone or his computer or whatever, and it's stone silent in the kitchen. He gets to thinking about that reaction, and he said, "Honey, how's your day been?" "Oh, it's been wonderful. Why wouldn't it be?" "Honey, is anything wrong?" "Oh, no." "Are you upset about something?" "Well, why would I be upset?" Now, I don't know if that rings a bell to anybody or not. But you see, here is a woman that is angry. Okay, she's angry, but she's denying her anger. And so anger is not a sin, but lying about it is. Think about that. And so when we're angry, we just need to admit that we are angry. Anger is not a sin. In fact, the Bible says in the Old Testament over 375 times that God gets angry. Do you know that? Psalmist said God is angry with the wicked every day. So anger in and of itself is not a sin. Jesus got angry when Jesus went into the temple and they made merchandise of his Father's house. You can try to, whitewash this any way you want to and all, but Jesus was angry. He just was flat out angry at what he saw was blasphemy. Anger may say, "I care." Anger may be an expression of love. Anger may say, "I love you too much to stand by and watch you waste your life." Let me tell you something else about anger. Anger is the number one cause of depression. Depression is often defined as frozen rage or anger turned inward. And just a cursory study of some books that dealing with emotional issues will tell you that the number one challenge of people that are dealing with depression is the fact that they have suppressed their anger. They have hidden their anger. They're not dealing with their anger. They're not dealing with their anger. They stuffed it all inside, and so problems get even worse for us emotionally when we're not honest with ourselves. And so the first thing for us to do is to admit our anger. The second thing we need to do is to understand our anger. The wise man said in Proverbs 14 and verse 29, "Those who control their anger have great understanding. Those with a hasty temper will make mistakes." And so we need to understand our anger. Now, in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, Paul said, "Examine yourselves." And then he goes on to say, "Whether you be in the faith." Now, there might be a lot of ways to decide whether or not we're walking according to faith or not. One might be attitudinally, whether or not we're dealing with anger in the right way. But we need to examine ourselves. So when you think about the issue of anger, and you try to have understanding about your anger, how do you express anger? Because all of us do it in different ways. So let me kind of give you some graphic ways that you might remember. Some people are like a skunk. They just stink up the place with their anger. Like the wise man said, Proverbs 15 verse 18, a wrathful man stirs up strife. So you see a guy that's full of wrath and full of anger. I mean, he just stinks the place up. He just stirs up the place with anger. But then there are some people that are like turtles. They withdraw. And that's where bitterness comes in, you see. In Ephesians 4 and verse 31, Paul there connects anger with bitterness. And part of the problem with anger and clamor and these kinds of attitudes, that when we withdraw, then our anger sinks into a type of bitterness. But there are some people who are like a pit bull. They just explode with violent rage. In Psalm 37 and verse 8, the psalmist said, cease from anger and forsake all wrath. And so some people's anger issues itself and wrath and clamor and just a rageful kind of a situation. They're like a pit bull that is on the attack. And then some people are like a cobra. They're waiting for a quick and a deadly strike. They're just biding their time. Like the fellow that said, I don't get angry, I get even. Now, see, he's not really telling the truth because he is angry. But he's just looking for that perfect moment where he can strike someone and he can retaliate. That seems to me like that might be a violation of a Bible principle, you suppose? Of retaliation? Well, of course it is. And so we need to understand our anger and how it is that we deal with anger. Now, there are basically four phases of an argument that lead us into anger. One is the recognition of the fact that we're in a situation. Now, we know that when some sharp words are exchanged or something is said, and we've all been there, whether it's with our husband or wife or children or parents, where there's a little tension and there's that recognition we're on the verge of something here that's not good. And so it might be a positive thing just to step back. See, we're talking about controlling our anger now, right? And to step back from that. You know, you've heard the expression that if you get angry before you speak, count to 10. I think there was Mark Twain that said, with some people you need to count to 100. See? Well, that whatever it takes for you, that you need to do what it is that you need to do when you recognize that. But if we don't recognize that and we allow then this to escalate, then that leads to a reaction. Now, a reaction is where you get into it. And people react instead of responding. And there's a big difference. When we learn to control our anger, then we learn to respond in the right kind of way. When we react, what almost always happens when I just have a knee-jerk reaction to something that upsets me, almost always I'm going to say something I regret. I'm going to explode, or I'm going to say something unkind, or I'm going to say something ugly. Something is going to come out of my mouth, or some action or attitude that's not what it ought to be. Now, you know what happens when we get to that point in our arguments? A lot of times we get mad, we blow up, we get into it, and someone stomps off, and then you can pout. Some people pout for minutes, some hours, some days. I've had people say, you know, my wife hadn't spoke to me for a week. And I go, really? Because of an argument. Well, that is certainly not a biblical way to handle things. We need resolution. We need to resolve the situation. We need to correct it. We need to get the issue right. And then we need to reconcile not only with one another, but with God. And so the command in James 5:16 to confess your faults one to another, pray one for another. You know, we've taken that command, ladies and gentlemen, and somehow put that in the assembly, that means that we're to walk down the aisle and come forward and whisper in a preacher's ear and say, if I've sinned. And you know, there's not one thing in James 5 that speaks about doing that in the public assembly. Now, I'm not critical of situations where that may need to occur. But that's talking about relationships. Do you suppose James 5:16 could possibly be applied in our home? Could that possibly have an application that when I've said something ugly to my wife and we haven't resolved that, then I need to go to her and say, honey, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I reacted in anger. I'm sorry for what I said. That was unkind. That was uncalled for. You didn't deserve that. I apologize. Will you forgive me? Would that be biblical? Would that be following James 5:16? Well, of course it would. And when we reconcile with one another, then we can reconcile with God. The psalmist said in Psalm 119, verse 59, he said, I thought about my ways, and I turned my feet to your testimonies. You know, when we think about our ways, whatever our ways are, whatever we're talking about, in this case we're talking about the issue of anger, then we can understand the root causes of what gets us angry. And I'm only just going to bullet these, but just think about this for a second. We get angry when we feel unaccepted, or unappreciated, or unsupported, or unprotected, or we feel uncertain. That there's all kinds of things that cause anger. We feel unaccepted and rejected maybe as we find comparison. And children sometimes get angry when we compare them to one another. Or wives become angry sometimes when they don't feel appreciated, when they're taken for granted, and they feel like that they don't have their husband's attention and affection. We may feel unsupported by people that love us either emotionally or physically or even spiritually. When we feel unprotected, we feel vulnerable. Life seems out of control. And when we feel uncertain, we don't feel like maybe we can trust each other if the people we love are really not being honest with each other. And so we need to understand our anger. But then that leads us to the third step, and that means I must immediately deal with my anger. Don't procrastinate when you're dealing with anger. So let's come back to our initial passage here in Ephesians 4. Put away lying. Let each one of you speak the truth to his neighbor, for we're members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath. The sad fact is that some Christians and some husbands and some wives and some parents and children have not only let the sun go down on their wrath, they've let many moons come up. Many, many days, weeks, and months sometimes have occurred with people being estranged from each other. Now, they may not go months without speaking to one another, but they may be holding in their anger and not dealing with their anger. They have procrastinated. J.E. Adams, in his book Christian Living in the Home, tells a true story about this husband and wife that came for counseling. He calls them in the book Sue and Wilbur. They're fictitious names. And he said when he came in for counseling, he said the Wilbur was just kind of nervous and everything, and Sue came in, and the counselor said, "Why are you here?" And she said, "This is why I'm here." And she threw down on the counselor's desk a manuscript that looked like about an inch thick. The counselor picked it up. It was typewritten on both sides of the page. And it was a list over their 20-year marriage of all the supposed wrongs that Wilbur had done to Sue. The counselor looked at it and saw what it was as he glanced through it and laid it down. And he turned to her and he said, "Ma'am, I don't think I've ever met anyone as bitter as you are." That took her back a little bit. But he said to her this. He said, "You know, what we have here is a record. It's a written record because you could put it down in black and white of not only what you believe he's done wrong, but it's a record of what you've done wrong. The way you've treated him. You know, love doesn't keep account of evil." Remember back a long time ago when we did our series on love, that was one of the lessons we talked about. Love doesn't keep a record of wrongs. And he said, you've got the record right here. And it is a record of not only your sin against them, but your sin against yourself and against God. And you have stored up anger and bitterness in your heart against your husband. The sun has gone down on your wrath many, many times over the past 20 years. That may sound a little bit extreme. And yet I have talked to any number of people over a period of time that have not dealt. This is a metaphor, obviously. But it certainly speaks to the idea of taking care of problems when they arise. Don't allow unresolved conflicts to keep growing, because they turn into bitterness, and then they turn into hatred, and then they turn into hostility. Let me give you a little phrase, and it's the title of a book by Albert Cliff, and it's simply this: let go and let God. I recognize, just from my practical experience of talking with people, that there's things that happen that are hard to resolve. I wrote this week in my blog about dealing. Someone had written to me and asked me to comment on Matthew 18 about going to a brother that has trespassed against you and how to deal with that. And I had 2 posts on that. And then I got an email from the individual that actually sent me that question and wanted me to talk to him privately about it further, because guess what? It's a situation in the congregation where this guy is in another state, and the person that has trespassed against the brother doesn't think he's done anything wrong. Now what do? He says. A person sins against you, and you go to them, and they say, I haven't done anything wrong. And then you take 1 or 2 more, and they still deny they've done anything. Now what do? Well, I'm not going to go down that side road and answer all of that this morning, but I'll say this: that's a tough situation. When a person doesn't see the error of their way, when they don't believe, when their perception is different. Now, is that ever, you don't have to raise your hand on this, please. You can just raise your right eyebrow. Has this ever happened to you in your home between your husband, your wife? Or maybe your parents and children? That one sees a wrong and the other doesn't see it. And I don't know what you're talking about. And I tell you what, I think sometimes it is possible for us, because the Bible tells us to be careful. Jeremiah said the heart is very deceptive. And we can deceive our own heart and honestly think, I haven't done anything wrong. I don't see that. I don't see it the way. And so our perceptions can be different. And so what are we going to do? Sometimes we just need to let go and let God. You know, 1 Corinthians 6, about brethren that were taking other brethren to court. And I know this is a different issue, but I think there is a principle there that he said, isn't it better sometimes just to suffer the wrong? And I think it comes to situations occasionally that are not going to be resolved, that someone has to be a bigger person and just suffer the wrong. And let go of it. Let go and give it up to the Lord. But I must immediately learn to deal with my anger. If you don't, it's going to cause you a lot of other problems. A lot of other problems. And so that means I have to learn to control my anger. The wise man said in Proverbs 19 verse 11, a man's discretion makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory, and we just talked about this, to overlook a transgression. See, a man that has discretion, insight, wisdom, prudence, is slow to anger, because you know it's not going to lead to anything good. Can you ever think of a time when you have really gotten angry at someone, I don't care who it is, and it's led to something really positive? Say, you know, that's one of the best things that ever happened to me when I blew up and threw a fit. Well, none of us can say that. It never, ever leads to anything good. Never does. But a man of discretion understands that it's good to be slow to anger. So, let me give you 4 very practical ways to learn to do that. Number 1, stop and just think about the cost. What is the cost of uncontrolled anger? The wise man said in Proverbs 29 and 22, a hot-tempered person starts fights and gets into all kinds of sin. Well, that's one of the costs. He's going to get into fights. It's going to lead him into other sin. It's going to lead him into other problems. One version says he gets into all kinds of trouble. I have a friend, and this happened to him many years ago, and I want to assume probably he has matured since he was a young man, but as a young preacher, he had quite a temper. He was running late one time as he and his family were leaving on a trip, and in his haste, he ran out of the house, pulled the door behind him that was locked, went to get in the car, and he left his car keys in the house. And he was already running late. And he went to try, the door was locked, there wasn't a window open, and he was so angry about that he just took his fist and ran it through the window. Well, he severed, I don't know what the artery is, it's in your wrist here, but whatever it is, he severed that. Ended up going to the hospital, and this has been a number of years ago, and ended up, he didn't have medical insurance, ended up about $20,000 in hospital bills. Because of what? A foolish reaction to something out of anger. That's a monetary cost. But there are physical costs, there are emotional costs, there are relational costs. You know, let me just say this to you, especially those of you that are young people and young married couples. Really work. If you got anger issues, you've got to really work at controlling this and dealing with it. You love each other a lot now, but if you don't, over a period of time, a few years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, if you don't get a hold of that, you can kill the love your spouse has for you just through anger. And some things you get to a point, you can't restore it. You can't bring it back. You've killed it. There is a cost to anger. I know in an audience this size, I very well am talking to some people, maybe they've been married a while and no one knows it, but you got a lot of anger issues in your home. And you're not getting them solved. You need some help. Okay? You got to find someone that can help you. About everywhere I've ever lived, I've tried to find Christian counselors that are schooled in this sort of thing, that deal with anger issues, and that can take time in detail to sit down and talk about some of the kinds of things we're just bulleting this morning. Someone said, well, Ken, man, I can't afford to go to a counselor. That's $150 an hour. You know what I tell a guy that says that, that's got marital problems? I said, well, how expensive is a divorce? Because the direction you're going, your wife's not going to put up with this much longer. Think you can afford a divorce? I'm not recommending that, by the way, okay? I'm just saying the reality of what happens to people that I've seen. But forget the financial cost. What about the emotional cost? What about the spiritual cost? What about your soul? We need to realize the cost. And then I need to reflect before reacting. The Bible teaches that, and we've already read several passages in the wise man that talk about that. But James says, so then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. That is to reflect and not react, and then to respond. There are three things here. If you do the first two, then you won't have a problem with the third one. If we're quick to hear, quick to listen, and we're very slow to speak, then we won't have an anger problem. But I'll tell you what my natural tendency is. You know what my natural tendency is. It's probably the same as a lot of you. My natural tendency is to be quick to speak. And to say something, and I no sooner get the words out of my mouth, I wish I hadn't said them. This simple passage will help us so much in our homes. And then I need to release anger appropriately. We've already said that anger is not a sin. And in the passage in Ephesians 4, not to let the sun go down your wrath, be angry and do not sin. Ephesians 4:29 says, Do not use foul or abusive language. Let everything you say be good and helpful, so that in your words you will be an encouragement to those that hear them. And so I need to release my anger appropriately. So when I am angry, admit, honey, I admit I am angry what you said. What you said made me mad. But in that, not to use abusive language. Not to say things that are ugly and unkind and vulgar. But if I apply this principle that everything I say, to let it be good and let it be helpful and let it be an encouragement, that we can solve this problem and we can get through it. So I'm going to give you 3 simple suggestions here. 1, when you're releasing your anger, be brief. Proverbs 17 and verse 27 says, a man of knowledge uses words with restraint, and a man of understanding is even tempered. That's what the wise man's saying. That don't go on and on. Maybe I need to turn to the ladies. I've been talking about the guys a lot. I won't say this is necessarily a female thing. It could be. Once you have identified to your husband the anger issue, and he's got it, he's got it. You don't need to belabor that. Okay? Learn to practice restraint and to be a woman of few words and to be even-tempered. You don't want to be like the fellow that said, well, my wife's even-tempered. She's mad all the time. You don't want to be like that. See? You don't want to be like that. You want to deal with your anger. Be brief. And then be specific. Now, ladies, I'll help you again here, because us guys have some problems sometimes, some housekeeping issues. And so rather than to say to your husband, you know, you're just a big slob, that may not go over too well. Suppose you just say, would you mind to pick up your dirty socks from the dining room and put them in the clothes hamper? See, that's specific, isn't it? See, just a little thing. Well, I will refrain here from any personal illustrations, but I can relate to this. I can relate to understand this. Be specific. It's helpful to me when my wife tells me what really will help her deal with the situation. And then I think the third thing is to be humble. The wise man said in Proverbs 13 and verse 10, by pride comes nothing but strife. Now, what is our problem a lot of times is we get into arguments and our anger begins to escalate. It becomes a pride problem, doesn't it? Because we have become entrenched in a position and we're not going to relent from that position. And so pride kicks in. And we're going to fight it out to the bitter end. Well, what's going to come out of that? Anything good? No. Nothing but strife. Nothing but anger. Nothing but problems. So I'm just going to bullet this for you. 7 rules for fighting fair. Never compare. Why can't you be like? Sometimes kids hear this. Your older brother, your younger brother, your sister, that sort of thing. Why can't you be like? Or some other husband or some other wife. Don't want to hear that. Never condemn. Like with words that begin, you always, or you never, or you must. Watch out for absolutes that begin with you. You. Something good is not coming. Or a command. You better do what I said. You start demanding, you're going to end up in an argument. Or a challenge. Don't make threats. You just try that and see what happens. Have you ever tried this with kids? I don't want to hear another peep out of you. Now, if you got a kid like we had 40-some years ago, what you will probably hear from that kid is peep. Some kids are that way. That's the way they're bent. It doesn't work. It doesn't work with husband and wife either. or to condescend, to belittle, to ridicule, to talk down to speak in a pejorative way towards someone else, or to contradict, to interrupt in the middle of a sentence, or to confuse the argument, like when you're losing an argument and then you change the subject and you bring up an unrelated issue because you're losing. Now, we can spend a lot of time in application talking about these things, but all of this speaks to the issue of learning to deal and to control with our anger. Realize the cost. Reflect before reacting. Release your anger appropriately. Then finally, I suggest rely on Christ's help. And I think it ultimately must come back to that. Philippians 2 and verse 5 said, your attitude should be the same as Christ Jesus. It should. Jesus was angry when he went into the temple. And he saw the money changers. And he saw them made merchandise. And he overthrew the tables. But Jesus' anger was controlled. It wasn't out of control. And when I get angry at appropriate times, then I need to control that anger in the right way. Paul further said in Philippians 4 that my God shall supply all your need according to His riches in Christ Jesus. All of my need? Yeah. My emotional needs. These challenges that I face in dealing with my temper, with my anger, with these kind of problems. Can God supply that? Can God help me control that and deal with that? Or are we going to be like people that say, well, preacher, you don't understand. That's just the way I am. Well, you know what God says if you got uncontrolled anger? The way you are is wrong. And the way you are needs to change. Let's don't justify ourselves by that's just the way that we are. Admit my anger, understand my anger, deal with my anger immediately, and control my anger. In our anger, Paul said, do not sin. As I was working on this lesson, I was reminded of a passage in Romans 12 that may seem to have nothing to do with this. But in the first couple of verses, Paul said, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what's that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And it occurred to me, we kind of live in an age today where there's a lot of angry people in the world. And to kind of go along with the way the world acts and reacts and deals with things and deals with people. I mean, we hear about road rage and workplace rage and all kinds of rage, that it almost becomes commonplace that we think, well, I'm not so bad because everybody else is angry. We live in an angry world. It's okay to be angry, but we're not to be conformed. The J.B. Phillips translation of that passage says, don't let the world squeeze you into its own mold. And I'd like to close with this analogy to think about. If you take a tube of toothpaste and you squeeze it, you know what comes out? Toothpaste? Yeah. You know why? Well, that's what's in it. Yeah. When you go to work tomorrow, get on Interstate 35 tomorrow, go to your social club tomorrow, do whatever you do tomorrow, chances are someone's going to put the squeeze on you. That may not have to be tomorrow. It may be your husband or wife or your parents or your children, and they put the squeeze on you a little bit. What comes out? See, it occurred to me one time that if what incessantly comes out is anger, that must be what's inside me. But what if the fruit of the Spirit's inside me? What if it's love and joy and peace and patience and goodness? What if I am filling myself with those kinds of things and someone puts the squeeze on me, and instead of retorting with some angry diatribe, that I respond in kindness and consideration and understanding and love and patience? So I'm suggesting the greatest antidote in dealing with anger is to put inside ourselves the fruit of the Spirit, goodness and godliness and the kind of virtues that when a squeeze is put on us, that we don't react in an angry fashion. May God bless us to that end. And may God bless our homes to be the kind of places God would have them to be. Well, you sure have listened good this morning. Thank you so much. I hope our lesson has not only been biblical, but I hope it's been practical and one that you can take home and use in your home and in your relationships. We close this morning to sing a song of invitation and encouragement that Stephen has chosen. It may be that you're here this morning and never obeyed the gospel of Christ. If you haven't, you need to. You need to make your home a Christian home. It could be that you are here and your husband or wife is a Christian and you're not, or your parents are Christians and you're not, or I don't know your situation. But why don't you make your home a Christian home so that you begin to follow the precepts and the principles that we've been addressing in this series, and to build your home and improve your home in the way Christ would have it. I know that's just a serendipity here on earth, because ultimately there's another home. It's a home in heaven. And it's that home that we're all striving to get to. And I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if we can't live in our homes here on earth the way God wants us to live, do we really think that God is going to usher us into His home if our homes are not right before Him? I think that's a serious thing for us to think about and to reflect upon. So we offer the Lord's invitation and encourage you to make your life right with God. And if we can serve you in any way, would you come now as we stand and sing?